our host, which means I will be handling all of the housekeeping and making sure that everything runs smoothly today. For those of you on the line, you should see a questions tab on the left-hand side of your screen where you can ask questions to the presenters at any time. You will also see a resources tab on the left-hand side where we have provided you a few assets that you can take home with you. Now, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. Don Shin from A10, Amritam Putatunda from Ixia, and Taka from A10 Networks, who will present Rethinking DDoS, Stronger Defenses That Make Economic Sense. Take it away, guys.
All right. Hey, perfect. Thanks a lot, Alex. All right, so thanks everybody for joining this session. We've got a lot of information to share with you guys, and sort of the agenda here is that we'll start with a little bit of market background there to sort of set the stage of how to improve your defenses and how to leverage testing as a method in order to be able to improve your decision making on your DDoS defenses. Right? Then at the end, we'll show you a demonstration of a methodology that Ixia has put together for being able to test DDoS defenses and some results of when they applied that methodology to the A10 platform. Right? So first off, I think that it's pretty clear, and the fact that you guys have joined this session, you would agree that there is a systemic problem in our industry around DDoS attacks. Right? Recently, we did a survey with IDG with your counterparts, and these are sort of the results that came back from that there was this 4 times increase in large attacks greater than 50 gigabits per second with a frequency increase of 307%, which is astounding, right? And as a result of this, it's clear that businesses are on the cycle of spending and investing on more DDoS defenses, and that this particular survey indicated that 74% of businesses are planning to increase their spend for DDoS defenses. And so part of what we want to show here is to sort of capture what does the landscape look like today from your defenses, and what are some of the better approaches that you can take, and then once again, how can you verify that by using testing as a strategy in order to be able to do that, right? And so, as a result of this, as people are making investments, they're looking at their existing DDoS defense strategies, and certain clear things are coming out. One is that the detection speed and the sluggishness of the mitigation, and that diversions are really becoming a problem. The way that businesses are building agility into their system, the DDoS defenses are not keeping up with that. And fundamentally, there's sort of an economics problem that we have to figure out how to overcome, because the fact that attacks are very inexpensive, and yet defenses are very costly, right? And tend to put quite a drain into an organization. So I thought we'd take a look at one example of this disproportionateness of sort of in this world that we live in today, right? And so I looked at a recent article, and I thought this was pretty interesting. So question, do you know this man? So his name is John Kelsey Gamble, right? Good-looking man, business type person and whatnot, but sort of what's interesting is that, so the FBI charged this Minnesota man for launching hundreds of DDoS attacks against his former employer and his business partners, right? So, that's pretty unusual in itself, in fact, that there's an attribution to who's doing these kinds of attacks, but it's just the average business people also, right? But more interesting to me about what this particular story talked about was that he contacted these 3 stressing companies, or DDoS launching companies, and he paid a mere $652.87. Right? And for that amount of money, what he got in exchange was 300 gigabits of dedicated bandwidth with unlimited usage, and he did this for 3 straight months. Right? And so once he had accomplished his first attack against this Washburn Computer Group, then he turned around and started launching attacks against a variety of different organizations. And of course, that's sort of the boys and their toys kind of thing, right? Once they have those capabilities, they're going to start to use it. right? And so this shows, the environment that exists and sort of why DDoS has become such a systemic problem, and it's so easy for nefarious actors to be able to launch these against you, right? And so as you're evaluating your decisions on how to improve your DDoS defenses, I think that there's 4 really important considerations that you need to consider in defining what is an effective DDoS defense strategy, right? And these 4, I think, can be broken down into these categories, right? Which, to a large extent, you could also translate this to what makes one DDoS solution better than another, right? So one element of it has to do with precision, and we'll go into a lot more detail associated with these, but even when we talk about precision, there's a business impact associated with it, which has all to do with detection errors, right? Because whenever there's an error, there's a cost, right? Part of the cost is going to be your response teams having to carve out time out of their busy day in order to be able to chase after non-existent events or an actual attack leaks through because the defense itself was too leaky. Then there's an element of scalability, especially given the environment we have around attacks around IoT and the capabilities that the attackers have. You really have to figure out what is the optimal way to scale in the near term as well as protect those investments in the long term, right? And then we talked a little bit about your frontline defenders, right? And the IT people and security people are just overburdened, and you need tools that are going to make them more effective, right? That leverages automation and those capabilities. And then lastly, this is just a systemic problem in the industry, is that overall the legacy DDoS defenses are just too expensive, and to be able to build adequate defenses costs quite a bit of money, right? So let's first take a look at the first one. So why does precision matter? And when you talk to DDoS defenders, these frontline DDoS defenders, this is a common point that they always say, and this is sort of their heartburn, is that there's just too many errors, right? But if we consider these errors, we need to sort of step back and think about what is the objectives of a DDoS defense, right? And I think that there's really 2 objectives here, and we need to be clear about which one is more important than the other, right? They're equally important, but the first one is that DDoS, right, it's a denial of service, is you're trying to protect your system for legitimate users, for the legitimate users to be able to access the system. And then there's a second portion of it, which is how do you protect your system from being overwhelmed? And you should always care about the first portion of it first, okay? And why is that important? For example, in DDoS, there's just a lot of collateral damage that happens when an attack occurs. And some of the collateral damage is self-inflicted based on the strategies of how legacy defenses work. For example, like remote trigger black holing or destination service rate limiting, using traffic shaping. These things should be the last course of action, not the first, because they're indiscriminate and they will accomplish the second priority, which is protecting your system from falling over, but it fails on the first one because of the collateral damage that you're doing. Because once you trigger a black hole, everything goes away, right? And in effect, you're helping to accomplish the attacker's objectives, right? And these precision errors that occur in the industry, we refer to them as false positives, which is blocking legitimate users, and false negatives, which are these attacks that are missed because the system is too leaky, right? And so what's needed for these kinds of defenses that you need for this coverage is you have to have full multi-vector protection. That means through the volumetric, through the network, through the application, including slow and low types of sophisticated attacks. Your mitigation solution should be very source-based. It shouldn't be destination-based. It should be source-based. The ability to be able to surgically differentiate between an attacker and a legitimate user and only block the attacker, right? And you do that by using peacetime learning so that, that your environment is unique and has unique characteristics, and the tool itself needs to be able to know how that behavior, and so that it uses multiple indicators or multiple tracking capabilities of behavioral characteristics that go way beyond just simple BPS or PPS kind of characteristics to be able to distinguish bots from users, right? And then it's that whole slew of countermeasure capabilities from layer 4 through layer 7 through authentication or through query or request limiting. And then there's another important element in DDoS defenses that are not leveraged nearly enough today, and that's threat intelligence, right? You know, it's common, you know, if you think about the criminals in your, you know, in your cities and whatnot, you know, there's a repeating offense characteristic. So there's these, you know, these the picture logs of criminals and their records, and so the police have that to be able to identify repeat offenders. And that's the same thing for DDoS. And today, most companies are not leveraging threat intelligence enough and incorporating them into their DDoS defenses because DDoS attackers use botnets and they're repeat offenders on how they use their tools. Right? So one of the things that we talked about was this collateral damage. So this particular slide is a little complicated and very technical, but here's a list of some of the strategies for countermeasures when you're under a DDoS attack. Okay? And on the left, what we're showing is that when you go from the top to the bottom, is that the top ones have very high impact to valid users as well as to attacking agents because, you know, like we talked about the remote trigger black holing or traffic shaping for a service. And the bottom ones have very little impact to the legitimate users because if attackers use sort of odd-looking packets in order to knock over a firewall or something, but there that would not be a normal behavior from a legitimate user, right? But what you see here is that so the top are lots of collateral damage, the bottom is no collateral damage, but the sophistication of attacks today play mostly in this blue range here, which is trying to use source-based behavioral characteristics in order to minimize or to be able to surgically differentiate between a bot and an attacking agent. And that's what strong DDoS defense solutions should have. And in the A10, we make a product that's called Thunder TPS, and that's what it does. It tracks these behaviors, has that full suite of mitigation or countermeasure capabilities, but really has strong capabilities in the middle area of being able to track behavioral elements of attacking agents. Okay, so now we talked about that, that portion. Now let's talk about the workflow, right? So another common complaint that you hear from frontline defenders is that the DDoS defenses require continuous manual intervention, right? And no organization has unlimited resources, and you're tying up your people from doing more valuable work under attack, right? And so what's needed, right? What's needed is to have mechanisms that have automation built into them so that you can do things based around policies and the tool will escalate as you go in. And I showed that earlier that not all mitigations are the same, right? There's certain types that are very system-focused, others that are user-focused, right? And so you want that mechanism to be able to step through that. And the other portion of it is that our modern IT organizations have really embraced orchestration and automation in order to speed up the deployment and optimization of their networks and defenses. And so you need this RESTful API capabilities to be able to control all of these, because at the end, you know, people are money, right? People and time is the critical, that's really the critical asset that any organization has, is their people. And so what's needed is mechanisms similar to what A10 provides with our 5-layer policy-based mitigation escalation. Here we have 5 levels, and so at peacetime we're doing learning, and then once we are tracking these 27 plus indicators to look for anomalous behavior, once that tripped, then it's going to escalate to level 1, start to apply some, you know, the lower level kinds of mitigations that are not so draconian or so aggressive. But as as the attack gets worse and worse, once we get to a level 3 or level 4, we're going to start to apply those rate limiting kinds of things in order to make sure that the system doesn't fall over. But the point is to first work on protecting your users. Only when the system's going to fall over is when you start to have to start using very aggressive techniques. And this should all be automated because response time is important in DDoS attacks, and people touching tools slows down the response. Right. Now, there's another element that we talked about earlier also, which is the scalability. Right? And scalability in the modern world, especially around the IoT bots, has more characteristics than what we traditionally think of as far as the data rates and packet rates, right? Because the attack landscape has changed, right? And one of the things that you see or you hear from companies is that, wow, if we have to get to these kinds of scale up and scale out, it becomes very expensive with legacy defenses, right? And so what's changed, right? And it's really around last year with the DDoS of things, and the DDoS of things is really growing, right? And what changed was that, one, the obvious thing was the intensity of the attacks, such as the attack on Dyn with 1.2 terabits peaking. But there's more to it than that, right? It's the width also of the attacks. These IoT are spread all around the world. They're geographically diverse, and there's millions of vulnerable IoT devices that a bot herder has access to be able to leverage. And then, of course, because of the fact that these are IoT devices that weren't built with the software update capabilities, these are persistent devices that can be leveraged at any time, right? And even after you reset it, they're still re-exploitable, and they're taking advantage of that. Now, there's another caveat to this as far as the sophistication that's available, because of the fact that because these are IoT devices, the malware writers don't have to hide in the kernel or anything like that, right? They get to leverage the full Linux stack networking capabilities, which make these devices even harder to be able to defend against, right? And you need that surgical capability as a result of that. And these statistics are around, what are the attacking agents? This year was really the crossover point where now there are more Linux-based botnets than there are Windows-based infected systems, right? And so according to Kaspersky, that last quarter, that 70% of the attack, nearly 70% of the attacks were created from Linux botnets, which means that cloud is being leveraged and IoT especially is being leveraged as agents for DDoS attacks. And so within our product portfolio, we address these scalability from the throughput capabilities, as well as being able to protect wider attacking agents. So, in this example we're showing is that we can track 128 million sessions at a time in our threat intelligence database, which we provide with the threat intelligence of known bad actors and which bots have been attacking in the last 2 hours, as an example. And the size of this is able to do this at internet scale so that we can incorporate those open resolvers into the threat intelligence portion of it for blocking, as well as the bots such as the Reaper bot that's been sort of spreading in the wild recently that looks like it's going to be used in some nefarious act, right? But the width becomes pretty critical for something like that. Right? But now, at the end of the day, especially when we're talking about DDoS, it all comes down to money, right? And for companies to be able to build adequate defenses, to have the ratio of mitigation capabilities to their total internet pipe becomes very expensive with legacy solutions. So here I wanted to show you a comparison of the 3 manufacturers, A10, Arbor, and Radware. And these are the flagship products that each of these companies are in the market with, okay? And so as you read across the line here, each one shows what size are they, how much bandwidth can they handle from a DDoS protection, what are the packet rates that they can do. And then down at the bottom, what we're showing you is a comparison between what is one A10 14045 device, how many do you need in order to be able to match up to the bandwidth from from Arbor or from Radware. And then a pictorial represents in how many RU units or rack units do you need in order to be able to facilitate the equivalence, right? And so the point here is that they're not the same, right? And these have a very big cost implication for, especially for large service providers that are building, huge networks, or large businesses that have huge networks, in the number of boxes that you're going to need, and which has a dramatic impact on the total cost, right? And managing these complex units or multi-racks of units in order to be able to get to these defenses, in order to be ready for these attacks from the DDoS of things, right? And that's where the important portion of what we want to share with you guys is that when you're making these investment decisions, there's more than just looking at data sheets or what you've used in the past and being stuck and continue to invest in a solution that may be inferior, right? And so our friends at Ixia, they came up with a DDoS testing methodology, right? A vendor-neutral DDoS testing methodology, and they invited us to provide equipment for them to be able to go through the process of the methodology so that it would extract data for companies like yourselves to be able to make a more informed decision, okay? And so I want to pass this thing over to Amritan, and for him to talk through the methodology and give you some more insights.
Thanks a lot, Don. Thank you all for joining. This is Amritan from Ixia. So when we're creating the DDoS test methodology, as Don showed earlier, there are several types of mitigation techniques. So for us, from the test perspective, it also became complex because we have to create test cases that cover this whole spectrum of different types of DDoSes that can actually expose a solution or its potential vulnerability against a particular type of DDoS variant. And those are some of the things that I want to cover in this next few slides, where I will be going through the dilemma of a test tool in terms of creating a comprehensive test methodology, what kind of hardware or what kind of challenges we faced, and I will also give a small insight of some of the DDoS test cases itself. Of course, I cannot go through the whole methodology itself and the test report, so I encourage you to download it and go through all the graphic details that it covers. First of all, when we were testing DDoS, the biggest challenge itself is the evolution of DDoS, right? Back then, when we got introduced to security and DDoSes, most of the DDoS was trying to attack one and only one thing, that was the bandwidth. They somehow tried to oversubscribe the bandwidth and create disruptions to normal services. But as the years came by and Internet of Things happened, and the CPU and the processors started increasingly becoming more sophisticated, and so were the applications, and people realized there are other ways to actually leverage DDoSes. So then came the memory, so other resources. They targeted other resources. Bandwidth was not the only resource. And then came the application-based DDoSes that actually targeted some of the vulnerabilities or some of the ways the application work itself and create huge DDoS floods, which would be much more difficult to stop because you cannot really stop the actual application traffic, right? But then again, how do you detect a DDoS that looks very, very similar to application traffic? The biggest challenge from the test tool perspective was of course, to mix everything together and create a DDoS methodology that has all of these running together. And let me explain you why that can be difficult. So as I explained, we need throughput and memory. Both has to be leveraged. So we have to have a volumetric attack, and we also have to target max number of sessions. So we have to create concurrent sessions, have those sessions being active in the test tool itself at the same time. We also have to have different applications and application DDoSes. So we need to have the granularities of application traffic, the integrated behaviors of the application traffic to create a proper application DDoS. We also have to have the scalability. We have to have, like in Mirai, we saw millions and millions of IP addresses or endpoints generating small amount of traffic, but when they came together, that became a flood of up to 600 gigs. So we have to simulate this huge amount of IPv4 and IPv6 endpoints. The most important part is that all these DDoSes counts for nothing if we do not have realistic application mixes. It's very easy to mitigate DDoSes if they are running in silo. You just have to block everything. But that's not how it works in real world, right? The application mixes, the real world applications, the throughput, the usual users and subscribers should have absolutely spot-free access to the traffic and should be able to do whatever they are doing while the mitigation tool blocks 100, 200, 300, whatever gigs of DDoSes and millions of sessions that are coming up, millions of hostile bot sessions that are coming up. So for all this to happen, we have to have a hardware, and for that we selected our CloudStorm hardware. The reason to select it is that because we needed to create both throughput and scale volumetric traffic, and that's where we need a strong FPGA. Similarly, for applications, application traffic and the intricacies of application traffic is generated by a network processor. So we needed a bigger network processor and a bigger FPGA and a very big pipe. So we had our newest CloudStorm 100 gig solution where we ran created some of those DDoS tests and ran it through them. I wanted to go through in very, very brief details of some of the DDoSes that we added. As I spoke in the first slide, that we have to have all different variants of DDoS. We cannot cover all the DDoSes that exist, but we need to have the checkboxes so that we have both volumetric memory, volumetric throughput, and application-based DDoSes. So for that, we started with UDP fragmentation, where we just created different sizes of UDP packets, but we intentionally fragmented it. So for a mitigation tool, it becomes tougher because it has to either resegment it or understand and identify and stop any kind of fragmentations. We also created different types of TCP floods, which are very common distractions, I would say. So we created a Christmas tree packet, which is basically a TCP packet with fin, push, urge added together. To increase the complexity even more, we added some data bytes into this packet so that it looks like real TCP transactions. Apart from that, we also added the SYN flood, which is one of the most common TCP attacks, where we send millions and millions of SYN packets to drain out any resources, any layer 4 capable devices resources. We also added a SYN fin. So there were a lot of volumetric traffic that was added. So SYN fin is again where it's a packet where both the SYN and the fin flags are enabled together. This used to be very, very effective volumetric DDoSes and have been in past known to bring down systems. And these are very simple as well. There is not a lot of complexities in them. But of course, we have to have all the different variants. So we also added some application-based attacks. And, one of the most common ones, of course, is DNS. We have multiple instances where DNS service, if it can be brought down, the entire website or certain infrastructure part of the website can be brought down. That's the reason this service is heavily targeted by DDoS solutions. You literally don't have internet. Technically, you will be out of internet if the DNS service goes down. So, of course, we try to have different variants of DNSs. We try to create malformed DNS packets and DNS query floods, where basically the clients are sending millions and millions of queries towards the victim server, and also certain malformed DNS queries. And apart from that, in this particular scenario where the methodology was created targeting a web server, a HTTP server, so of course it made sense to have a lot of HTTP-based attacks. And one of those attacks was excessive post. In this attack, we were just trying to upload a certain amount of random large files into the server, just to overload the server with a lot of bandwidth and throughput, and so that it cannot scale. This apart, we also had the low and slow HTTP attacks where we were sending incomplete HTTP headers, a few millions of them, trying to trying to suck up every resources that are there that gets busy so that the actual legitimate responses are getting blocked. So as you can see, if you see this methodology, this is how it was supposed to work if the mitigation tool works. So it should work. It should be blocking all the HTTP slow lorries which were marked by the red line while the legitimate response goes through. Similarly, we also had NTP flood. NTP flood has become very common. There were certain vulnerabilities in the NTP network time protocol, which has been exploited over and over again for DDoSing purposes. So we created NTP flood where the attackers here pretending to be NTP servers are actually sending an NTP response, huge number of NTP responses towards the victim. So now, not every attack that we had here made sense for a web server, but the reason we had different combinations was to create a comprehensive variant to understand if the mitigation tool is indeed capable of blocking everything and has the right strategies to block different variants of attacks, even though some of them might not make sense for the victim that they are protecting. This apart, this is where we created some randomization. So we do have very realistic simulation of Mirai, the botnet and CNC communications that is followed by DDoS attacks. And we went through and created something which was unique, created our own floods, which preceded a DNS, a Mirai bot to CNC compromise. And we created some floods which were which are relevant to this particular network, like DNS, HTTP flood, but also some other floods which may not be relevant to this particular server because it's the HTTP server, but it still is a very, very effective DDoS attacks, like, Valve source query engine for an IoT or for a SCADA-based system. So that's a very nice attack. And every time we ran the test just to have the random factor going, we started certain random variations of attacks. Like, in DNS flood, we were changing the queries from A to IPv6, which is AAA query. So things like that to create some random variants and understand that it's not something that is highly optimized to protect only a certain types of attacks, while if things change, it starts falling. So that was in our mind while creating these attacks. So ultimately, which was very what would I say, a very pleasurable experience, at least for me to see, was to combine everything together and create this huge flood of attacks that included the excessive posts, slow lorries, the Mirai with all these 5 variants, the network time protocol attacks, the amplification, the DNS queries, and UDP fragmentation, and those volumetric, everything coming together. But at the same time, it's mixed with those legitimate responses. So for a mitigation tool, it has to apply all its techniques at the same time and ensure that all these techniques are not hampering the legitimate request, because the legitimate request will still have DNS, HTTP, HTTPS requests and responses, and that should be unaffected while this whole big flood 300 gigs of attack is blocked. Now, of course, you will see this if you go through those details. You will see some of these attacks, how it happened, how we configured those attacks, and things like that in quite graphic details. What we did also was to see individually mitigation. So we sent all these attacks individually, like UDP fragmentation, NTP, HTTP flood, and things like that. And we saw mitigation efficiencies. We measured in a granularity of nanoseconds to see if there are impacts, if there are slowdowns, and overall resiliencies as well. The big spike that you see at the end of this test case, this is of course a test case that ran for hours and hours. The big spike that you see is where every DDoS attack that were there were combined together, and we really stressed the system to its health and see if it's able to simultaneously apply all the mitigation techniques to block this massive flood of DDoS attacks. Now, I wanted to briefly talk about the hardware that we use for this exercise. We used our CloudStorm. This is our new 100 gig platform that has a strong 2 network processors, onboard encryption, and a stronger FPGAs to send applications, throughput, layer 2, 3 types of traffic all simultaneously together, which led us to create this, helped us to create this 300 gigs of DDoS. That is, along with up to 60, 70 million connections to ensure that both memory and throughput are leveraged. We use Breaking Point as a software here. It's one of the very well-known software security test solution. It has 38,000 plus attacks and malwares, 40 plus different DDoS variants. Of course, we used only 14 or 15 variants, but depending on the situation, you can have all the variants together. One of the important thing also was that we mixed these realistic applications with it, and for the reports, we had nanosecond granularity of reporting for this hardware. So we used 3 CloudStorm cards to generate this 300 gigs traffic towards the victim. The victim and the clients and the attacks, everything was simulated by Ixia's CloudStorm. With that, I want to pass it over to Taka, who was my counterpart in this exercise, and he can talk about the A10 part here.
Thanks, Amritam. So DDoS mitigation device used for this test was A10 flagship model, Thunder 14045 TPS, which has a industry-leading performance, for example, 300 gig forwarding mitigation the bandwidth and 440 million packet per second performance. As Don explained before, it provides surgical DDoS protection against multi-vector DDoS attacks. Let's take a look on the test topology. Ixia Breaking Point is simulating client and attackers and servers. A10 standard TPS is placed in path between untrusted zone and trusted zone for the always-on protection. TPS provides DDoS detection and mitigation on the same box in this test case. On the left, listing up all the 10 attack profiles and legitimate user traffic, which is used for this test. Since Mirai attack and DNS DDoS having multiple attack vectors, so total 15 attack vectors configured for this test. As Amrita mentioned, we test individual tests first, and then finally we test all the full attacks at the last. So today we were showing some test recorded video for the multi-vector attack with the full attack spectrum. So we'll have Amrita back and start with the Ixia Breaking Point section. Amrita, go ahead.
Taka. So this is literally a 2 hours plus attack, but we wanted to show a small snapshot for this particular webinar. What you see, and if you can see the bandwidth section, this is the 5 gigs of realistic application traffic that is being sent. Ideally, for all the attacks, this traffic should remain undisturbed. And what I'm showing here is where we created all the DDoS vectors all together. So now you see the TX bandwidth going up 75 gig to 55 gig. It should reach somewhere around 300 gig. That was the all the DDoS vectors that I talked about together coming towards the server. And you can see some of these flows that we created, the Mirai flows that I talked about, the HTTP post, low loris, UDP fragmentation, NTP amplifications, things like that. And you can see all of these writing. So you probably will see some of those attacks actually getting successful. It's from the client perspective, it is successful because it's able to send the packets. But ultimately, when you see the reports, and that's where you will see if the packets have actually reached the victim interface or not. And you will understand whether the mitigation tool was successful. So let's also see the TCP floods. As I showed, we had multiple TCP floods. So you see we are literally sending 26 million TCP connections per second. And by the success rate, you can easily understand that A10 is able to mitigate most of it. So this is the interface here. The attack, once the attack goes down, or even when the attack is there, you can see the RX of 5 gig. That's very important. That basically signifies that out of the 6 interfaces that are sending traffic, the RX portion itself remaining at 5 gig means that all the attacks got mitigated and the realistic traffic was not impacted, and the server was able to service all the clients that were there at that point of time. So that's the attacks coming down and the system going back at 5 gig. So this is just a small snippet. You can see the failed portion as well, and this is from the statistics. But ideally, when you go to the reports, that's where you will get the granularity of attacks and what happened, what was the actual impact, if there was any latencies on the HTTP sessions and things like that, which were the attacks that generated the most throughput, which are the attacks that targeted the memory and things like that. With that, I would pass it over to Taka to talk about the A10's perspective of the attacks.
Okay, thanks. So let me quickly go over the test result from the standard TPS side. Here showing the traffic chart on each protect services, for example, HTTP, DNS, and TCP, UDP, and other ports. So you see all drop traffic showing red, and all the pass traffic, quality traffic in green. So here's another summary chart that's including some session count you can see on the top right. So here the system health on the standard TPS box. As you see on the CPS usage on the bottom right, you can see the maximum CPU usage like roughly 50% or so. So now moving to the mitigation console providing live DDoS dashboard. As you see the green, the chart, that is actually indicating live traffic or legitimate traffic. On the right-hand side, it's providing the DDoS statistics and counters. You can see symphony attack and Christmas flag attack counters. Now we can provide also the detailed look on the HTTP service. On the right-hand side, you can see some counters, drop counters for TCP authentication, HTTP authentication, HTTP service. That's actually indicating the protection against the post-flood attack, SYN-flood attack, and slow release attacks. This page also provides more detail on the attacks. As you see, the top sources against the packet rate, or forwarding rate, or packet drop rate. Those kind of details are available on the mitigation console. Now moving to the DNS service port. As you see, majority of traffic is showing red, which means successfully dropped. On the right-hand side, you see some counters for the service limit and DNS authentication and DNS services. That's actually indicating the protection against DNS flood attack, also DNS malformed attack. It's also providing some statistics against the amplification attack, indicating NTP or DNS on the right bottom. Now moving to the TCP service port. This is more likely showing the protection against the Mirai attacks. That's including command control center connection. The next one is a UDP. This is showing the result from against the fragmentation attack. And last, this is showing the summary log, the DDoS log from the TPS. As you see on top, from the top, post-flood attack and symphony attack and Christmas tree attacks, and also several fragmentation attacks. And finally, we can see the DNS malformed query attacks. So TPS successfully detected and mitigated those all attacks. So in summary, as we see, TPS successfully defend over 300 gigabps attack traffic and also legitimate traffic. And due to its performance and efficient design, including hardware assist capability, for example, for the symphony attack or Christmas tree flood attack, TPS only utilizes up to 60% of this CPU all the time, while having all the 300 gig attack traffics. With standard TPS surgical DDoS protection, all 15 attack vectors are successfully mitigated. And more importantly, there's no network traffic interruption to the legitimate user traffic. So this concludes our test recordings and test result. Okay, back to Tom.
All right. Yeah, fantastic, guys. Now, for all you guys, I know that's a lot of information to take in, right? But at the end, this is really how can we help you, in this threat environment with DDoS? And especially these investment decisions sometimes are very expensive, and you need some real data in order for you to do that. And so we're very excited that Ixia has published this DDoS methodology. These are the assets that are available for you to be able to download as well. I think off of this session. So hopefully you gather some information. Please do take a look at this and consider this as you make your decision. We think it's a great way to be able to do head-to-head analysis of when you're going to make an investment, or really is to consider, are your defenses adequate today? Right? And testing is a wonderful way to be able to do that. All right. So it looks like we have a little bit of time to take some questions. If Alexander, Alex?
Yes. So sorry, I was on mute and I could not get off. As a reminder, everybody, the questions panel is located on the left-hand side of your screen. So go ahead and add some questions in there. And I do see that we have one question, and I think this is a question for Ixia, but I'm not sure. What is your criteria to select the DDoSes that you put in the methodology?
Thanks, Alex. I will take that. So basically, when we created DDoSes, as I said, we had around 40 plus DDoS attacks to choose from, but we wanted to create a variation that would include volumetric throughput, volumetric memory, application-based. So and some Mirai like the bot-induced attacks. So that was the criteria where we wanted to pick some from every end of the spectrum to have a very comprehensive coverage. So the good question. Thank you.
Awesome. And I think this one may be for you at A10, Don. DNS is our biggest problem. What does it do to protect DNS servers?
Okay. Well, yeah, I think that really is an important portion because, as we know, DNS is what makes the internet work. And I think there's really two parts to that question, and so maybe we can try to address both sides. One of the problems with DNS and as Ritin talked about, is DNS infrastructure being used as a mechanism for using reflection attacks for generating a lot of volume, right? And that's definitely a problem. But for many service providers, they're also offering DNS services. So these DNS servers are being attacked as a mechanism to be able to shut off downstream customers from the service providers, right? And so the thing that you have to look for, especially for around DNS, is because the attack strategies are changing so much. In the past, as these attacks were being used against DNS servers, you would make these queries over and over again to the servers. And so then, the technology has evolved where now many of the DNS servers have request rate limiting so that they know that, oh, well, why is this particular agent asking for the same thing over and over again? And so, now there's these attackers use these DGAs or domain generation algorithms that are creating that ability to be able to continue to query, but they send it for different domain names or these random domain names. And so as for DNS defenses, these things are quite complex, and what has to happen is, in addition to doing those high-level things of request rate limiting, you actually need some deep packet inspection capabilities to really understand the queries around the FQDN, every element of the FQDN. And so, yeah, absolutely within the A10 Thunder TPS, it's actually a very good, powerful solution around DNS because of the fact that we're going very far into the query. We're not just limiting query requests. We're actually looking at the FQDN, the request type, and applying policies in order to be able to provide that resilience for DNS services.
Awesome. Let's see here. I think this is another one for Ixia. We saw in the video the RX traffic going up slightly once the DDoS attack started. Does that mean the victim did get affected partially?
That's again another very good question. What I would when we started generating the traffic, right, the DDoS traffic, what I think, and probably Taka can come in as well, I think is that A10 has different types of challenge mechanisms, and those challenges were coming at us. So we, from the client side, from the attacker side, were registering those as RX traffic or received traffic. When we actually dig in and went into the reports, we saw that from the server side, at least, none of those responses were coming in because none of the DDoS requests got in. So I believe there was the mitigation tools had different challenge mechanisms for countering the several variants of DDoS attacks we sent, and that's where we saw a bump in the RX traffic from the client's perspective.
Hey, let me chime in. So that actually your understanding is correct. So on the standard TPS, we have multiple challenge or user authentication mechanism. It doesn't really the authenticating user, but from the source IP perspective, we are just trying to make sure this is a valid user or not. And some of the challenge actually, we are sending back some challenge, like a sync cookie is one of the example. We have those kind of mechanisms, including for the DNS or other protocols too.
Awesome. Looks like we have another question here. Does Defender TPS appliance have a fail open functionality for production traffic interfaces when the appliance fails?
You know, let me take a shot at a portion of that, and then Taka, you can jump in as well. So there's the answer to it is that in some of our appliances, we do have hardware failover in the traditional sense of what people think about L2 inline kind of things. But in addition to that, the other portion that maybe was missed was when Taka was talking about that in-path capabilities is the TPS has integration both at layer 2 and at layer 3, right? So it has all the routing protocols built inside of it. So, you know, from a redundancy capabilities and from being able to change maintenance and things like that, that layer 3 integration becomes a pretty powerful way to be able to do that as well. You know, most people think of inline and L2, right? But I think you should also consider L3 in path because that actually has quite a bit more flexibility. Taka, is there something else to say about that?
No, actually you're right. So with having layer 3 or dynamic routing protocol capability, we can work around those kind of the failover scenario using routing protocol, especially for the big the architecture topology. If we are considering a small the enterprise use case, maybe L2 in path or inline will be ideal solution.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody, and thank you to our star presenters. As a reminder, we have included the resources, which you should see on the left-hand side of your screen. Thanks to everybody who joined us today, and thanks to everybody who made this webinar happen. You will receive an email with the on-demand webinar shortly. As a reminder, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Don, Amritam, or Taka directly. Thank you all again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on another one of our webinars.